Hey everybody, in this exercise we are going to explore how to use event trapping. And so what do we mean by event trapping? So the use case we have here, this is a spreadsheet or worksheet that we developed in one of our earlier videos. And it has to do with, we were learning about how to use if statements when we explored this the first time, and also learning how to use controls. And the objective of this spreadsheet is to determine if someone is qualified, if an engineer is qualified to take the professional engineering exam. And in order to do so, have this. The first question is, have you passed the FE exam, the Fundamentals of Engineering exam? And that's something you take typically after you get a bachelor's degree in engineering, and that needs to be yes. And then you need to work for at least 4 years under the tutelage of a licensed professional engineer, so that needs to be 4 or 5 or something like that. And then just for fun, we say you cannot have graduated from the University of Utah. That's not a real requirement, that's just something I threw in there for fun because that's the rival of my university. And so that checkbox has to be 0. And then so we have this, you click on the button and it says no, you don't qualify. And so if you get all the conditions right, it says you qualify, and otherwise it puts a series of reasons down here depending on what options you put in. And okay, so that's the scenario we're dealing with. But back to the topic of events. We've already been working with events in that when you double click on a control, it basically pops you over to a sub called, in this case, the control is called opt-fes, and it says opt-fes underscore click. So that is a sub that is executed in response to the click event on that particular button. And we also have, if you go back to Excel, if you double click on this button, that's the CMD qualify underscore click. So this is the code that's executed when the user clicks on that button. Well, it turns out there are lots of other kinds of events. So I'm going to, up here, in whenever you may or may not have noticed, but at the top of each window in the Visual Basic Editor, on the left side, there's a pull-down menu that lists the objects associated with the sheet or workbook, or depending on what you're looking at here. And you make a selection. So if I do opt-fes, the default event is the click event. But over on the right, it lists all of the different event types associated with that particular object. And again, typically you do the click event. There's also there's a double click. If you, for some reason, if you wanted to have some action that's associated with a double click event, I mean, let's just try that for fun. And we'll say message box double click. So let's see if this works. I'll go back here and say this is opt-fes. I exit design mode and double click there, double click. If I single click, nothing happens. Actually, I could make something happen if we could go over here and say message box, oops, here we go, click. So if you click once, you're going to get click, and if you click twice, you get a double click message. Let's try that. Click, okay, and double click. Okay, so yeah, there you have it. What else can we trap on over here? So we can do got focus. That means the cursor, it's highlighted as you tab through the controls. Mouse down, mouse up, lost focus, key down, key press, key up. So there are a bunch of things. Normally with a ActiveX control, all you're really interested in is a click event, but that's kind of how that works. Now, another kind of something else that you can do with this is you can trap on events associated with the worksheet. And so I'll get back to that in a second, but let's talk about what we're trying to do here. What we're going to do is we are going to get rid of this button and make sure our code is still executed as appropriate. So the way this works now is you make a set of selections and then you click the button to see the results. But we're going to change this so that the second each of these options is changed, we are going to instantaneously display the results. And so the way we do that is, first of all, we're just going to delete that button. And then we're going to go into the code, and we still have the code for the click event for this, but we're going to change that name. We're just going to call it qualify check or something like that, or qualify test. So we'll say check to, or test to see if you're qualified. And then we'll go back here, and now we got rid of the button, so we're going to say we're going to double click on each of these controls, and then I'm going to copy that sub name and then paste it right here. And then we're going to go do the same thing for the no button, and then we're going to do the same thing for the checkbox. So the theory here is that we are going to, so this code up here is already set up to do all the testing to see if someone is qualified and then display the results at the bottom part of the sheet. And so the second the users click on any of these buttons, we're just going to go ahead and call that code. And so this is how it works. So you get instantaneous feedback on those particular things. If I make this bigger, then I could, yeah, there we go. And so that works, but what's left here is this number of years of work experience. That is not an ActiveX control. All that is a cell. And so what we want to do, it'd be nice if we could call our qualify underscore test sub whenever the user changes this cell. And that's actually a fairly common scenario you run into when you're adding Visual Basic to your Excel workbooks, is when a cell or one of many cells or a range of cells is modified. Sometimes you want to run some code right away without having to click on any ActiveX buttons. These ActiveX buttons are nice, but another thing to remember is they're not available if you're running your Excel code on a Macintosh or an Apple computer. And so in the Mac OS, they're great for the Windows platform, but that is one limitation. So sometimes you can just key off whether or not a cell value is changed. And the way you do that is if you go over here and go up to the top, and instead of selecting one of these controls we've created, if you select the worksheet object, then what it does is over here on the right, it lists this set of events that you can trap on. Now, by the way, when I say trap on, I mean that's a term we sometimes use in this environment. It means we're going to, when that event happens, we want to have some code that's executed in response to that event. And so the default, and each object has a default event. The default event for a worksheet is a selection change, and so it's already down here at the bottom. Let me scroll that up a bit. It's already created an empty sub for a worksheet underscore selection change. And what happens is if you want to, you can check to run some code every time the user selects a new cell or set of cells on the spreadsheet or on the worksheet. So that's, I haven't found too much use for that, but you know, there might be some scenario where that's useful. And it passes in an argument called target as range, so it will actually tell you that it'll pass in a range object which corresponds to the new selection. And so that's kind of nice. But let's look at some others here. There are a bunch of stuff associated with you know, tables and pivot tables and hyperlinks. There's also an activate sub. That's a fun one. So I'm just going to say message box welcome to my sheet, and then I'm going to go back to Excel. I'm going to create a second sheet here, so there are two sheets. And you notice when I go back to it, it says welcome to my sheet. So when I go here, I get that. I come back, it says welcome to my sheet. So that event is triggered when the worksheet is activated. You can also do a worksheet deactivate. So here I'm going to say message box goodbye. So now if I go to another sheet, it says goodbye. And if I come back, it says welcome to my sheet. And that only works on that particular sheet. So I can switch between these two sheets and nothing happens. But when I go to here, welcome to my sheet and goodbye. Not that that's a particularly useful piece of code, but it just shows you can, that's another thing that you can trap on. So yeah, there are things, there are also, if you double click on the workbook window, there's actually code associated with the workbook in general. And so there's a workbook open event, a workbook or before close event. So you can have a message that pops up whenever the workbook is open, maybe like a splash screen that gives some information about the worksheet. And so I'm not going to go through all the different kinds of events, but suffice it to say there are a lot of different events that you can trap on. But the one that we're really interested in here, yeah, let's see, let me clean up some of this stuff that we created. Again, back to our case, we want to be notified when this cell here is changed, cell B6. It's also called years. And so if we go to the worksheet, and then there is there's a calculate event that's updated whenever the you know, something is changed so that the sheet is recalculated. That's not the one we want to get. The one we want is the change event for the worksheet. And so the way the change event works is whenever a value of a cell, one or more cells, has changed, then we get this event is called. So now it might be tempting to just copy and paste that, say, okay, something has changed, go ahead and test. You've got to be really careful with this worksheet change event, and the reason being is it's really easy to get into an infinite loop. And the reason for that is if I have it coded just like this and the user comes in and changes this cell, it will call this sub, and that sub will call the qualified test code, and the qualified test code is going to write some, depending, no matter what options are selected, it's going to write something to one of these cells as part of the code. Well, guess what? When that happens, that triggers another change event, and it calls it again. And then it goes back here and changes a cell and triggers another change event, and it calls it again. So you get an infinite loop. So there are a couple of different ways you can deal with this. One way is to there's an application dot enable events equals false. So you can do this, and then down here you can set it back to true. So basically what this does is this enable events equals false. What this does, it says, okay, I'm going to turn off event trapping. So as long as that's set to false, no events are generated. and so it won't, you know, modifying a cell would not initiate another call to this function. And then down at the end, you always got to remember to turn it back on. Application.events equals true. If you don't turn it back on, then the events are permanently off, you know, until you save and reopen the file, for example, or actually quit Excel and relaunch it. And so you got to remember to turn it back on. So this should work. Let's try that. Save our changes in case it doesn't. So now I'm going to go in here and change that to 3, and look at that. It is actually calling our code. So if we go in here and set a breakpoint, say I'm going to change that to 5, sure enough, it is calling this code, and I can step down through here. It's modifying cells, and away we go. It turns it back on, and we're done. Everything works great. Now, there is one important caveat associated with this method to making sure you don't get into an infinite loop, and that is, let's say you do decide to step through this in the debugger, or there's a bug in here, and you stop execution before you get back down to this line. Then the events are off, and you actually have to go in and make some, you know, you have to force it to turn it back on. So that can be a little problematic. So I'm going to show you another way to do it. I'm just going to turn those 2 lines of code off by commenting them. Another way to do that, to do the same thing, is you can test the value of this target parameter that's passed into the change event. So you can do something like this: if target.address equals dollar, let's see, what are we at here? We are B6, okay. $B, $6, then qualify test, and if. So what we're doing is we're checking to see if the cell that was changed is B6. So the point then, if you call qualify test, it's going to change these cells down here. It's not going to change this one. So we're basically saying the only change event we're really interested in is one where this cell is changed. The rest of them we're going to ignore. And that avoids your infinite loop problem. So you got to be careful. When I first started using this, I would type if copy that, if target equals range B6, then qualify test, and that works most of the time, and logically that makes sense. I mean, it looks like you're saying, hey, is the cell that was changed B6? But that's not really what this statement says. This statement, remember that each object has a default property, and the default property for a range is a value. So what this statement is really saying is if target.value equals range B6.value, and that's kind of different than saying, are these the same 2 cells? Because theoretically the user could change a cell somewhere else on the spreadsheet that has the same value as B6, and then it would say, yep, they have the same value, go ahead. And that's not really what you want. And that's the risk of that happening in this case is really low because we don't really have any other numbers. But as a general principle, I think it's a lot safer to say if target.address equals, you could say range B6.address, that works. Or you could just type the address explicitly like this, and it's done with dollar signs. It's an absolute address. And so this should work. Let's go back and give this a whirl, and hopefully we haven't gone into an infinite loop. And sure enough, it works like a charm. And this little sub here gets called a bunch of times for every time one of these other cells are changed, but the address of the cell that's changed is not equal B6, so the only time it runs this qualify test sub is if that is actually the case. So there you go. to summarize again, we have modified this workbook so that instead of making some selections and clicking on a button to run the code, we've gotten rid of the button, and we have modified that the code that does the checking that used to be associated with the command button, and we've called that modified sub qualify underscore test every time the user clicks on any one of these controls, and then that's immediately tested. Or if the user changes this value, we use the worksheet change event, and we make sure that the actual cell that was changed is the one we're interested in, and then because we got to make sure we don't have an infinite loop, and then we call that sub, and it does all the tests. So we're able to have all of the conditions tested using our code, using events without using a command button. And we looked at some other events, activating a sheet and opening a workbook and so forth. And so, yeah, hopefully by now you'll see that there are a lot of other kinds of events to play with in addition to a click event, and it allows you to do some really fun things with your Excel workbooks.